Okay, today we are going to talk about 29 for other groups besides African Americans who are seeking their rights. So, first we'll talk about women's rights. Um, the Equal Pay Act was one of the first things, the law that was passed trying to get employers to make it illegal for them to pay women less. I don't know if you know, that was quite a thing that even for the same job, men would traditionally be paid more because the view was, well, the men have to, support the family. And so, we need to pay them more and women can be paid less. And there was a big fight for the same job should be paid the same amount. So that was, an uphill battle. And even today, the pay is not exactly the same. There's still a problem with that. Okay, one of the famous people who was writing about this was Betty Friedan. That's that first picture there on the left. She is the writer of The Feminine Mystique and some other books, and she became a very outspoken person saying, basically women should be treated equally to men. And I'm not saying, down with men or anything. I'm just saying like we deserve to be treated the same, right? And it's okay that women don't. The mystique part was there was a time where it was thought women should just be happy little homemakers, right? Like and this is for her saying this, that it's okay to be a woman and want a job and working outside the home, and you don't have to just want to be a wife and a mother, and they're so that's her whole book is about kind of changing the way women are viewed. So that idea about being a woman's right activist is called being a feminist. And the National Organization for Women started around this time. Now it's still around today. My sister actually worked for them for a long time. And they do things trying to fight for equal rights for women in a lot of different areas: jobs, education, marriage. My sister was big trying to get, women who were like abused and things, trying to make sure they have rights, and so that they can be safe and things like that. The Equal Rights Amendment was a proposal called the ERA for short, to amend the Constitution of the United States. And the point was to guarantee that women are equal and should be treated as such. Very similar to in the amendment, right? We made African American amendments, several of them, really making it clear that you have to treat them the same and their rights are the same and all that, right? So women thought that they needed an amendment to clarify their position too. One of the people who was actually outspoken against this was Phyllis Schlafly, and Schlafly is the woman on the right there, who you can see it says danger ERA and stop the ERA. She wasn't the only one. There are other women who felt like this was upsetting men's and women's roles by saying that women should be treated exactly the same. I have a little video to show you that she says, she doesn't want the roles to change. And so she feels like this is too upsetting, too much of a change and it'll mess up the family dynamic, right, if women go to work and things like that. Unfortunately, there was not enough support, and so this amendment did not get ratified. So I think it is kind of telling that the rights for African Americans, which was a very controversial issue, right, got passed way before like women's rights do. And so that's very interesting, I think. But to say that, that just because they didn't get this change to the Constitution doesn't mean women didn't, start improving their lot. We do see women getting more jobs in a lot more fields and becoming doctors and lawyers and all these things that, previously, I don't know if you know this, but previously, there were certain jobs like women, it was, if you had to work, right, it's okay if you're like a teacher or, something that was like womanly, right? But being in a job that is aggressive or anything like that, like a lawyer, or they were not, it was not seen as like okay for a long time. So they start breaking those barriers down and getting more jobs in, and also in government positions too. One of the most famous is Sandra Day O'Connor. There's a picture of her when she was a little bit older after she held it for a while, but she was the first female U.S. Supreme Court justice ever, appointed by Reagan in 1981. So notice how late it is that a woman's finally on the Supreme Court, 81. Okay. And there's still more men today than there are women. Okay. Now we're going to shift gears and talk about other groups that also were making strides to improve their rights. Latino rights is another major one. Latinos, if you don't know, Latino is someone whose their family background is from Latin America or Spain. And so Spanish speaking, right? And so that we have, of course, Mexican Americans is the biggest group, but we also get people from all, other Latin American countries. And so there's some numbers there to show you how big an increase the immigration has been. In 1960, it was about 3 million, and now in 2019, it was 50 million. Okay. So a lot of Latinos are making a big portion of this, especially Mexican Americans, right? And so one of the groups that were having a hard time were migrant farm workers, right? Migrant farm workers pick the crops, and so they work very long, hard hours for low pay, and they have to move from farm to farm to pick their crops in order to make a living, right? And so these children who are in these families, they end up moving a lot, and it's hard. They don't settle down and have, continuous schooling and things, so it's very difficult. So Cesar Chavez is one of the most famous people who he grew up this way, and then he went in the military and came back, and he wanted to help the migrant farm workers to, make a better life for themselves. And he thought the way to do that was to unite them in like a union. Okay. And of course, the owners of the farms don't want that to happen, right? Because if you're unionized, then you have more bargaining power, and they can, demand better rights and money and things like that. So it was an uphill battle, but he did eventually successfully make the United Farm Workers Association, so UFW, and it's not association, it's just United Farm Workers. And one of the reasons he was pretty successful is because he followed the nonviolent philosophy of Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King. And he tried to get attention for their plight without using violence or anything. So one of his most famous things he did was he organized a grape boycott. There was a particular problem with the growers in the San Joaquin Valley here in California, and he wanted them to let them have their union, contract, negotiate their contracts, and the grape, owners didn't want to, and so basically he got enough people to hear about this and that get enough people to boycott buying grapes that it would make a significant impact, right? And that they finally would cave in and say, okay, fine, we'll do what you want, so people will buy your grapes again, right? So anyway, he does a lot. He's very famous for helping the plight of these migrant farm workers. And then the other two groups here are also Latinos. Puerto Ricans come, I don't know if you know, but right, if you remember, but Puerto Rico is a Commonwealth of the United States. So people who live there are actually U.S. citizens, even though they can't vote in a presidential election. And they don't have quite the representation that we do, but they are very poor in Puerto Rico. It's quite a poor country and island. And so a lot of Puerto Ricans try to migrate to the United States to find work, right? And they go all over, but a lot do seem to go to New York City, is quite a big place. And they have faced quite a bit of discrimination over the years. And then also we want to talk about Cubans who also have faced discrimination. A lot of Cubans came, more than 200,000 in the 60s, because Fidel Castro came to power. He was a dictator and he set up a communist, harsh government. We'll talk about him more in future chapters. But anyway, to say that people wanted to leave and they came to the United States, and even more in the 80s. Also, it was another influx, and a lot of them end up living in Florida. They come, and I showed it on the map for you to see where Puerto Rico and Cuba are, so you can see why it makes sense that they're very close to the United States. And like for Cuba to Florida is just like a hop and a skip and a jump, right? So you can understand why a lot of Florida has a lot of Cubans. So anyway, they've experienced quite a bit of discrimination, unfortunately, also. And then the last group I want to talk about is Native Americans. Actually, there's two groups. Native Americans. I'm sure you know, we didn't talk about it too much this year, but I'm sure you've known in the past that Native Americans, right, has a very hard history with the U.S. government, them being pushed off their land, forced onto reservations, a lot of being tricked out of their land, or we've gone back on our treaties with them. And after World War II, there was a lot of encouragement for Native Americans to leave the reservation and go work in the cities and things like that. Well, what ended up happening is, unfortunately, Native Americans end up being very poor, and about a third of them were living below the poverty line. Remember, we talked about that poverty line being you have to have enough money to live at least decently, right, with a roof over your head, enough food and everything. So that's that line. So if a third of all Native Americans are living below that, they're really struggling, okay? And so in the 60s, it's a time where people are like fighting for their rights, and there's a lot of civil rights movements going on. And the Native Americans also are looking for independence from the government. They don't like that the government over the years has, controlled their schools and made their children learn like white history and, the English language, and they've been losing their culture and their language and things over the years. So there's been a big push that the Native Americans want to be more in control of their own schools and reservation and, not lose their culture. So there's a few different things. The National Congress of American Indians forms, and they are a group that are trying to fight for this, fighting for Native Americans to have a right to control their own destinies. And then there's the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968, which actually was protecting the constitutional rights of Native Americans and saying that they do have the right, like the reservation is supposed to be their, it's like their sole little country almost, right? That was the treaty that we made with them when they pushed off their land, that they would be able to run it how they wanted. And so it emphasized this, that they can make things. And so that's why, I don't know if you know, but for instance, like gambling. Sometimes gambling in a lot of states is only allowed on Indian reservations because in some states that's illegal to gamble, in a lot of states. But yet the Native Americans could decide that they are making it okay for them, and then that people come into their casinos and gamble, and they make money to help their Native American people. So anyway, That's just one example. The American Indian movement is another group that became very vocal during this time in the 60s and 70s. It's called AIM for short. And you can see there's a picture there. They did a series of things to get attention for their cause. And it's always about, right, the government is going back on their word, their treaties, decisions. So they're trying to get attention for their cause. You see there Clyde Bellacourt and Dennis Banks are the founders, and then Russell Means is one of the big leaders that becomes very vocal. He's there in the picture. One of the things they did is they took over Alcatraz Island, and they wouldn't leave. And you can see there in the picture, they have like spray painted or painted on the sign, the welcome sign, and said like it's basically Indian land. They're taking it back, and they refused to leave there for quite a while. Eventually, they did give in when they, said that the government would look into some of the things they're saying. And then they also took over the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. When they're tried to, get attention for their cause, and, no one would listen to them or make appointments to talk to them. And so they basically like took over. So that's the picture on the right. They kind of were trying to camp out and, get attention for their cause. And again, same thing. They're just trying to get people to listen, that the government doesn't, fall through. And then the last one is Wounded Knee. So I don't know if you know your history, but Wounded Knee was the site of a Sioux massacre back in 1890. And so they picked that site on purpose to help the other Sioux that are living today, call attention to the cause of, how terribly the Native Americans are doing and how they're living in poverty and everything. And they picked that site on purpose, right? Because it was and they took over by force. I don't have a picture in here, but they had weapons, and there was some violence. And so basically, they did end up, again, giving up and leaving after they got quite a bit of attention for their cause. Okay. All right. And the last group is disabled. So also during the 60s and 70s, you see people speaking up and saying, you know what? You need to make things more equal for people who are disabled. So for example, they did pass rules that said if you have to make it so people, like, for example, in a wheelchair can enter that facility. So I don't know if you ever noticed, but public places like restaurants, government buildings, things like that, they're required now to have some kind of ramp so that you can enter the facility if you are in a wheelchair or other disabled, that makes it hard to climb stairs. So I don't know if you've never pay attention next time you go somewhere, that you may not have realized that that's a requirement now, and that wasn't always there. So imagine how hard their life was before that was a requirement. Also, they started requiring that more people hire. A lot of people would just not even consider people who are handicapped, and so they started making some requirements around that. Also, the big thing was that they required in 1975 that education for all handicapped children. This was an act that said, of course, that, they have the right to have the same education. And so you have to provide services for these children. In the old days, schools just weren't equipped to deal with people who are handicapped. And so they just would not get educated. And now it's a requirement that public schools have to accommodate them. So that's why they have special classes now and other accommodations or aids or all these things to try to help make it a fair and equal education for them.